Governments became very interested in these things because people were saying crazy stuff on them, right? Yeah. And people were often posting pictures of themselves doing crimes on Twitter and other social networks. So, of course, governments became very interested in this stuff. And then, there are ways to use these social networks to spread propaganda, to, do covert messaging.
Do you know of any data or any statistics that suggest peak acceptance for, I hesitate to call this a data violation, but has the pendulum start to swing back the other way?
I would point to the fact that when I started writing this book, Apple, which has some 50, 60% of the market share in the United States, had a menu where there was a little option called limit ad tracking, and nobody knew it was there and nobody knew what it did. But what it essentially did was Apple gave everybody a unique identifier for advertising purposes. Corporations could access that unique identifier and target you under that identifier rather than something more permanent like your name or your phone number. It was meant to be a privacy protecting mechanism, but of course it's a proxy for you, and these advertisers could pretty easily link your anonymized identifier to you or your household or your consumer profile. And Apple, at some point when it released its new operating system, I think in 2020 or 2021, put a different label on that. They called it cross-app tracking, and it is now prominent in the Apple privacy menu. And it very prominently asks, any app that wants to do this has to ask, do you want to allow this app to track you across or track your usage across multiple apps? And some overwhelming percentage of people have opted out. So when you give people real, meaningful privacy choices, when you call it what it actually is, which is cross-app tracking, people tend to say, I don't really want to be tracked across apps. The problem is that too many of these corporations don't want to give consumers real, meaningful choice. They want you to get frustrated with those menus that say, we respect your privacy choices. Please make the following 25 selections and click off all the things you don't want. Or you could just click accept all and get to the thing you want to see immediately. They want you to click accept all. They are putting barriers in between you and getting what you want in the hopes that you'll get frustrated and just grant your consent. So I think the key is giving people meaningful and easy choices that... And when people are given those choices, they tend to opt out. They tend to choose the more private option.
So it seems like there's progress being made in at least a couple of these areas.
I think so.
Feels that way, at least comparatively to where it was maybe 5 years ago.
Yeah, I think that's correct. But I think it's also a game of whack-a-mole in some ways because, as one surveillance vector closes, usually another opens. And so governments are very clever. Corporations are clever.
Maybe I'm brightening this a little too much. Maybe it's actually like slid back even in the face of, some forward progress.
Well, there's an anecdote in my book where one of the sort of central people that had kind of invented a government location tracking program using app data, I'm sitting with him and I ask, what are you working on now? What's the next thing down the pike?
That's a great question.
And he just chuckled and said, and he invoked that old Looney Tunes cartoon where the wolf and the sheepdog, they're buddies, but they, do their mutually antagonistic jobs every day. And then they go home and they have a beer at the end of the day.
They clock
in and they clock out. I can't remember. Ralph Wolf and Sam Sheepdog.
There you go. Yeah,
you're right. He's basically like, it's just like that cartoon, right? Like you're trying to get the sheep, I'm trying to protect them, but at the end of the day, we can clock out and have a beer. But I'm not going to tell you. You're going to have to figure that one out. that was his message. And I'm sure the government is up to something that I haven't even thought about. And I'll report on it in a few years from now.
Morning, Ralph. Morning, Sam.
What are the differentiators between how surveillance is being conducted by, a country like China or a country in the EU or the United States?
Sure. So the United States is a rule of law country, and so are our European allies and many of our allies around the world. So that means that we have checks and balances. We have functioning court systems that, by and large, in the United States, for example, spy agencies are not supposed to generally spy on Americans. And most of them aren't even allowed to operate inside the United States, with some limited exceptions. Our law enforcement entities generally need to get court orders or warrants. And even when they buy data, they still need to present this information to a jury, and a jury convicts someone. So we do have functioning checks and balances in many ways. Now, again, I've highlighted the ways in which data brokers and all this data for sale and for the taking does make the government's job easier and is tilting a lot of the power towards government, but we still are a rule of law democracy. In places like China and Russia, these are not rule of law countries, and they are turning the weight of their surveillance apparatus on their own population in some cases. You've seen a lot of use of digital tools of repression in places like Xinjiang and China, or in Russia and the Ukraine conflict, or against domestic opponents of the Putin regime. And then those same countries are turning those cyber capabilities on the world as well. So and China, and to a lesser extent Russia and North Korea and others, they are trying to vacuum up all the data that they can get from the world. And they are using it for their intelligence purposes, for their national security purposes. And that is a persistent challenge to the West, in that these corporations and these technologies that Western companies have created are now being turned around and repurposed against citizens in the West, in some cases against dissidents who speak out even from the safety of Western countries. In other cases, they're being used to do surveillance or to do espionage or to recruit spies. There's all sorts of things that a foreign adversary can do with lots and lots of data about a population.
We've talked a lot about surveillance and espionage that you just brought up, and some of those uses for this data. I would assume there's also a push component to this, meaning you can use this data to influence. You can use this data to not only change opinion, but change the course of history in some ways. And that governments are doing that with commonality as well, or frequency.
Part of my book, about a quarter of it actually, is about social media. And governments at some point realized that people were saying all sorts of stuff publicly on social media in ways that were perhaps somewhat unexpected, right? You had terrorist groups sometimes putting a lot of information about themselves while being hunted by these very governments on the internet. And so
I love the example of the particular jihadist that was traveling from, exactly.
There was a jihadist who left GPS coordinates attached to all his tweets.
Yes.
And in addition to that, he was doing stuff like tweeting pictures of himself in front of certain mountains that had distinctive shapes that intelligence analysts could then go to the satellite data and say, I think he's here, right? Because that mountain is a very unique shape. So, governments became very interested in these things because people were saying crazy stuff on them, right? And people were often posting pictures of themselves doing crimes on Twitter and other social networks. So, of course, governments became very interested in this stuff. And then, there are ways to use these social networks to spread propaganda, to, do covert messaging. We saw that turned against us during the 2016 campaign when Russia ran what they called an active measures campaign to denigrate Hillary Clinton and to sow chaos in the US election and to potentially boost Donald Trump. And that really was a divisive thing that happened. This is a battlefield. The internet, digital networks, they are a place where states try to run covert propaganda campaigns, some of them pretty ham-fisted, perhaps some subtly effective. I don't know the answer, but it is something that's happening, and it's something that all citizens need to be aware of when they're using these networks.
Does the surveillance we've talked about so far affect some marginalized communities differently than other communities?
I think it does. It's a good question. I think, and I don't think that's limited to digital surveillance, right? If you think back on American history. Anti-war protesters and civil rights protesters and African Americans in general have long been the targets of sort of state efforts to surveil certain communities. And so that doesn't change even in the 21st century. I think potentially the communities change a little bit depending on what's in the news. So, I mean, I think obviously a lot of the post 9/11 surveillance was directed, unfortunately, at the Muslim community in the United States and the Muslim world abroad. I think LGBTQ people have been targeted in some ways, and there are anecdotes in my book about, again, the Catholic official who was using Grindr, for instance. And in general, vulnerable groups, ones without political clout in society, tend to have the burden of the state fall on them the most, or the suspicion of the state fall on them the most. And they don't have as much power and thus can insulate themselves less from the consequences of state action. Actually, I think it was the Freddie Grey protests in Baltimore, and a number of social media firms were selling access to data from Facebook and Instagram and Twitter, and were touting to police departments their ability to really help monitor protests, and in some cases find people with active warrants participating in protests, or identify people who committed arson or looted a storefront during the protests. And so this really set off a lot of concerns among civil libertarians that police were using these social media monitoring tools to get into activist spaces, to monitor what activists were doing. And their point was, by and large, most people who were protesting were doing so lawfully. We're not burning down buildings. They were just out there trying to express their views on policing and on racial justice, and police were unfairly targeting them, were unfairly infiltrating their spaces. On the other hand, it's undeniable that in many of these episodes of protests, there were elements of civil unrest, or there were people that went out and burned buildings or looted a liquor store. And again, not the majority, but there was that. That did happen. And so police are in a very difficult spot when it comes to these sorts of things, right? If they monitor activist communities too heavily, they're accused of sort of interfering in people's lawful right to protest. But if they don't monitor them enough, they're accused of potentially missing things, whether not prosecuting people for vandalism, or whether sometimes you have mass shooters or terrorists who are planning their attacks out in the open by sort of hinting that they're going to do something. And police agencies are routinely criticized for missing those warning signs. And so I actually don't think there's particularly good answers as to where to draw the line on police monitoring of these social spaces.
Because we use the Freddie Grey example you mentioned a lot with local police, are there other ways in which marginalized communities are disproportionately affected? Maybe if it's just corporations using their own data, or non-government entities using the data for other purposes?
Well, the economies of digital advertising and the app economy means that it's often a luxury to be able to pay for privacy, right? Sort of the lower down you are on the economic spectrum, the more incentive you have to trade your data away for free service. Yeah, because
that's a great point.
The wealthy can easily afford a few bucks a month for a private email server, or a new iPhone that's got better privacy features than an old Android. But it's, people lower down on the socioeconomic spectrum, that money could be used for other things. And so they are often incentivized to trade away their data. And that means that, both corporations can target them for things, and not always great things, right? Like sports betting and payday lending. And, there's all sorts of things that get advertised to low-income people that maybe aren't the most socially beneficial companies out there. And then also the state gets a lot of that data and surveils those communities more heavily. And, that's part of the dynamic.
And I would assume that would extend to lenders and how these communities interact with other corporations. Like you said, what ads are served, potentially, enhancing food deserts in a way, or exacerbating, I should say, not enhancing, by pushing fast food restaurants and all of these equivalents as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are these techno-optimists that sort of believe that the internet would sort of level the playing field. I don't think that's really borne out in the last few decades. That, if anything, there's as much of a divide online between the haves and the have-nots as there is in real life.
In terms of data security, how this data is used, who's using it, et cetera, where are you personally, you BYRON TAU, optimistic, and where are you a little bit pessimistic about where things are at right now?
Yeah, so I think I'm optimistic insofar as I do think there are very good privacy services out there. I use a lot of them. I think in particular, Apple is not a perfect company by any means, but its products tend to collect less data than Android. It has some very cool privacy features, including a private browsing feature, like a Tor-like network that they've built directly into iCloud, as well as the ability to make and control your own data that I think are useful. Again, it's not a perfect company, but there is a market out there for these privacy and security respecting services. Lockdown mode on the iPhone is very cool. And then there's all sorts of other companies that have private email products, private servers, private communications. So there has never been so many good and healthy privacy respecting technologies.
I think that's a good answer for the optimistic side. I think it doesn't mean that people stop being vigilant about their own privacy, et cetera, and just let the corporations make things better for them. But that I think, if anything, it illustrates that people need to continue being vocal if they want to see these improvements.
Yep. I do have some pessimistic.
That was my next question. Yes, I wanted to hear the other half of that.
I do think that the sort of advertising model is going to be very difficult to completely undo. And I don't have a lot of hope that legislators or regulators will be able to fundamentally alter the nature of these services. That ultimately, paying for a service, there's a lot of resistance to doing that among the population, in part. Sometimes it's socioeconomic, and sometimes it's merely people have grown accustomed to getting things for free on the web and are resistant to paying. And there's a lot of money invested in the targeted advertising ecosystem. There are some of the biggest technology and advertising and consumer companies in the world, all depending on this system. And so, I don't know that we're headed towards a healthier internet anytime soon. And I think the rise of generative AI has changed the calculus even more, because companies, again, are hungry for data to feed into these models, and they're going to collect every last scrap of private, first-party data that they have access to train models, unless consumers raise an issue with it.
Ultimately, what I take away from this is, if we let it continue, it will. And if we intervene, the consumer intervene, then we might be able to slowly work this back a little bit and to our advantage.
I think that's right. Corporations and governments are only going to do what consumers and voters let them do. And when those people who ultimately make choices about who to vote for or how to spend their money, when they make those choices and they punish corporations for bad behavior, then governments and corporations tend to be responsive. And so I do think it's up to all of us, right? If you have to decide what the technology future looks like and where you're willing to spend your money, who you're willing to vote for, and what you're willing to put on your device.
Have you ever done an interview in a storm?
I don't believe so.
We're gonna try. Should we open this wine?
I think so.
Okay. So how did you get into investigative journalism?
Well, normally you don't start as an investigative journalist.
Sure.
Normally you start as a very junior reporter doing something.
Is that how you started?
But yeah. So, the old career path in journalism was to go to a small city and cover the sewer board, and then work your way up.
Yeah.
But when I started in journalism, things had changed to the point where you could go somewhere directly, like Washington, D.C., and try to get an entry-level job there. So I graduated college in 2008. That was in the middle of the Great Recession. I also wasn't 100% sure what I wanted to do with my life. I thought it would have something to do with government or public policy or writing about those things. But I hadn't had it figured out when I graduated. So I moved to DC with not much of a plan, and I took an internship on Capitol Hill, thank you,
You're welcome.
with my member of Congress from Massachusetts.
Yeah.
And I figured out pretty quickly I don't think that was a great fit for me.
No. Why?
So-
What was it about it?
I didn't really like working in partisan politics.
Okay.
I much preferred to be outside the system throwing bricks than trying to build the wall. And
Okay.
I'm not knocking people that try to build things for a living, right? I think it's actually very important, but it's also important to have people that are critics.
Yeah.
That look at things from the outside. And I think just personality-wise, I think it suited me better to be more of an outsider.
Cheers to
Cheers,
that,
yeah.
right? If that's how you felt, that's how you got started?
Yeah.
Yeah, what was your first step as an outsider?
To get a master's degree in journalism, because I didn't have a lot of credentials to be a reporter, graduating college. So I enrolled in a master's program at Georgetown. I waited tables at the Cheesecake Factory to pay my bills.
Okay.
And I just started doing a bunch of internships. So my first one was at Roll Call, which is a Capitol Hill newspaper.
Okay.
Then I got another one at the New Republic magazine. And finally I did a third internship
Where at?
at a publication called the National Journal, another kind of insidery DC publication. And that was like a full year of internships. Landed a full-time job at Politico.
What was the environment? Politico, not neutral, right?
It is new. I mean, it was aiming to be a nonpartisan, but
Okay.
high energy publication. It was definitely still in the phase of just coming out of being a startup. It had launched in 2007. I joined in 2010, so it still had some of that scrappy startup DNA in it. And it was a great first job. It's widely read inside policy and political circles. It's great training to be a young reporter. My first job was I was Ben Smith's editorial assistant.
Okay.
He went on to found BuzzFeed News
Yes.
and then Semaphore. In between, he was a media columnist for the Times. And then I got a gig as a White House reporter, which sounds like a cool title, but the actual job involved like writing up what Barack Obama said as quickly as possible for the website.
Help me envision that. Were you in the room asking questions or?
Not usually back then.
No.
I was mostly sitting at my desk
Okay.
trying to get whatever the press secretary or whatever the president said on the internet in the shortest amount of time possible.
I see.
I did that job for a year, and then they gave me a little bit more, like, as cool as it is to say you're a White House reporter, like, that really is a transcription job, and so they
Sure.
kind of pushed me to do a little bit more reporting as a beat, and so they put me on the lobbying and campaign finance beat. And I was originally kind of skeptical, and it turned out I actually loved that job, covering money and politics and power and the ways in which corporations and special interests can and sometimes cannot influence the political process was
I
a
see.
really cool job. And so that took me through my time in Politico.
Yeah.
I got a job at the Journal in 2014,
Right after Politico? Or
right after Politico.
Yeah.
And I was a White House reporter there for 2 years. That's when I was in the room asking questions.
Got
So
it. Okay.
If you go back to any of the press briefings
Yeah.
during the latter 2 years of the Obama years, there's a good chance I'm sitting in the second row all the way to the right if you're looking out at the press gallery.
How does President Barack Obama say Byron?
The press secretary called to me all the time,
Okay.
but I never got a question for the president.
Never to the Journal.
Usually my colleagues who were a little more senior would sit in on the presidential press conferences.
Okay.
He did one time answer a question I shouted at him,
Okay.
which is a tradition among the press corps.
Yeah.
If they let you in the Oval Office and there's something going on, you try to bait the president into saying something.
Sure.
And so people were trying to bait him into saying something about whatever, and instead I was like, I got one out of left field. Bill Murray had been spotted walking around the White House grounds that day, and this is pretty normal. Celebrities go in
Sure.
and out of the White House. So I just yelled, "Did you beat Bill Murray?" And he said, "Sure did."
That one goes on your CV,
Yep,
right?
Yep.
So you were at the Journal.
Yep.
What track did you take at the Journal to kind of weave to ultimately means of control?
Yeah. So I covered 2 years of Obama. I covered the 2016 presidential campaign, and after that, I wanted to move away from politics. I had done it for a long time, so I got a job as a Capitol Hill reporter, and on the Hill, I gravitated towards covering a lot of national security topics, including the Russia investigation into Russian interference in the 2016 election. And I eventually, my editors liked my work there, thought I had an aptitude for kind of national security and courts and law, and so they put me on the Justice Department beat. And I was basically a brand new reporter on that beat, and there were two other reporters. They were more senior than me. They had been covering the Justice Department for a while, so I was like, what do I write about, you know? How can I distinguish myself on this beat? And that's sort of when I stumbled into this story about data, the ways in which law enforcement was buying the movement of phones and creating a surveillance technology out of it. And I thought that was a pretty wild story. And so I started digging around on it. I published one story right before the pandemic, like it came out in February of 2020, and then everything shut down, and I was at home with a lot of time on my hands.
To dig deeply into this.
Exactly. And so I just kept digging. I thought, I published one story I thought was pretty good. Let me see how far I can take this. And that culminated in me eventually getting a book contract and writing the book. And so, yeah, it was a 4 or 5 year, actually it was a 6-year journey from the time I originally heard that tip to when I published the first story.
I want to thank you for coming out here, not only physically and traveling to our location and being a part of our concept, but I also want to thank you for the work you do. I think shining a light and sort of the darkness of corporate surveillance or corporate data gathering, and then what ultimately ends up being government surveillance is important. I think just exactly what you said, that if people knew they would opt out, I think that speaks volumes to whether or not it feels right. I appreciate your time in not only having that discussion, but for doing the work to illuminate that.
Well, thank you so much. It was great to come out here to beautiful northern Michigan, and thank you so much for having me.
Well, thank you very much.
Cheers.
Cheers. What do you think of the wine?
I think it's good.
Yeah?
Yeah.
I thought it was pretty good too. I'd be honest if I didn't, but